Saturday the 22nd of May 1915, in the midst of the First World War, Britain experienced not a battlefield loss, but a catastrophe on home soil. A collision of 3 trains near a small signal box in southern Scotland, Quintinshill, would result in the worst railway disaster in British history. 227 people were killed. But what made it all the more tragic was that the victims were mainly not civilians, but soldiers. Men of the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots, on their way to the Gallipoli campaign. And yet, over 200 of them would be killed long before they ever reached the battlefield, in a terrible inferno. So, what exactly happened that morning? And could the disaster and the loss of all those young lives have been avoided? This is the story of the Quintinshill troop train disaster. By May 1915, the recently launched Gallipoli campaign was already faltering. Reinforcements were urgently needed, and amongst those ordered to join the Dardanelles front were the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots, part of the 52nd Lowland Division. The Royal Scots had been raised in 1633, and through its long history had served in some of the great battles of British military history, including Sedgemoor, Blenheim, the Peninsular War, and Waterloo. During the Victorian period, they had fought in the Crimean War, the Second Opium War in China, and the Second Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. By the time of the First World War, it was the oldest and most senior infantry regiment of the line of the British Army. In 2006, it combined with the King's Own Scottish Borderers to become the Royal Scots Borderers, which in itself would merge with other famous Scottish regiments to form the existing Royal Regiment of Scotland. The 7th Battalion was a territorial unit made up of part-time soldiers who'd volunteered before the war. The Territorial Army had been created by the Haldane reforms of 1908 with the aim of bolstering Britain's home defence without having to introduce conscription. It brought together the old volunteer and yeomanry units into a more structured reserve force, ready to support the regular army in a national emergency. Since the outbreak of war in August 1914, the 7th Battalion had been deployed on coastal defence duties along the Firth of Forth, guarding against possible German naval attacks. The battalion was recruited almost entirely from the burgh of Leith, a separate town to the north of Edinburgh, and the neighbouring district of Portobello. One company also drew men from nearby Musselburgh. These were local men, shopkeepers, dock workers, office clerks, who'd volunteered to serve. In April 1915, the battalion were moved to Larbert, near Falkirk, to concentrate with the rest of the 52nd Division. They were initially earmarked for deployment to France, but with the disaster unfolding at Gallipoli, plans changed. They would now be sent to the eastern Mediterranean instead. The battalion was meant to leave on the 21st of May to embark on the troopship Aquitania in Liverpool. The Aquitania herself had only recently entered service. A Cunard ocean liner launched just a few months before the war broke out, she had been requisitioned and converted into a troop transport. She would go on to carry over 30,000 British and Commonwealth troops to Gallipoli. However, a delay occurred when the vessel ran aground in the River Mersey, and the departure was postponed by 24 hours. At 3:45 a.m. on the 22nd of May, the first of 3 trains carrying the 7th Battalion left Larbert Station. This one contained A&D companies, along with battalion headquarters, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William Carmichael Peebles. 2 more trains followed, one carried B&C companies, the other the battalion's supplies and horses. These 2 trains took an alternative route south, and would thus avoid the fate that lay ahead. The carriages the men travelled in were outdated wooden-built relics, lit and heated by gas stored in tanks beneath the floor. The carriages were so old that they'd actually been earmarked for scrap, but needs must in wartime. Meanwhile, down the line near the village of Gretna, the Quintinshill signal box was preparing for a busy morning. The signalmen on duty were James Tinsley and George Meakin. Now the 2 had held a long secret agreement. Whichever of them was due to start at the 6 a.m. shift could arrive half an hour late, and the other one would cover for them by jotting down train movements on a scrap of paper. These would then be transcribed into the official register later, making everything appear proper on inspection. On this particular morning, James Tinsley arrived late as usual on a local train which had picked him up in nearby Gretna. The local train was made up of a few carriages and a milk van. To make way for two express trains coming up behind it, it would normally be shunted into the northern loop siding at Quintinshill to allow the express trains to pass before continuing on its slower paced journey. But today there was a problem. The northern loop was already occupied by a goods train, so Meakin, still manning the box, made a routine decision. The local train was moved on to the southbound main line temporarily until the expresses passed. Almost as this manoeuvre was being completed, a coal train arrived, travelling down from the north. As the southern line was now blocked by the stationary local train, the coal train was shunted into another loop, this time off the southern line. So we now had both loops occupied, as well as the southern line with the stationary local train. Nevertheless, this had cleared the line north for the two express trains. Once they'd passed, the local train would join them on the northbound track, followed by the freight train and the coal train heading off in their respective directions. Meanwhile, in the small signal box, where regulations stated that only one man should have been on duty, Tinsley and Meakin had been joined by the brakeman from the local train, the fireman from the same train, and the guard from the coal train. The latter four were reading the newspapers and discussing events far away at the war, not least the landings at Gallipoli, whilst Tinsley was writing up the last half hour's trains in the register to make it look like he'd been on duty since the start of his shift. It was, on the face of it, just an ordinary, if busy, day at Quintinshill. At 6:38 a.m, the first express, an Edinburgh-bound train, passed through on the clear northern line. The London Euston to Glasgow express was just over 10 minutes behind, steaming towards Gretna. But then came the final piece in what was to become a deadly puzzle. The troop train carrying the Royal Scots. A message had come down from Kirkpatrick's signal box offering the southbound troop train to Quintinshill. The procedure was simple. The receiving signalman could either accept or reject the train, depending on whether the track ahead was clear. Tinsley accepted. At the same time, the Gretna box offered the northbound Glasgow express. Tinsley accepted that as well. And yet, just outside the signal box, sitting squarely on the southern line, was the local train, exactly where the troop train was heading. Quite how Tinsley failed to notice it remains a mystery. Was it distraction, carelessness, or something more? We do know that he suffered from epilepsy, a fact that was known at the time, but never raised in the court proceedings that followed the accident. At 6:49 a.m, the troop train came into view. It was travelling downhill, gaining speed, close to 70 miles an hour. And due to a curve in the track, the crew would only have had seconds to react. The driver and fireman saw the local train too late. The brakes were applied, but the troop train ploughed into the stationary local train at around 40 miles an hour. The impact was devastating. The front carriages of the troop train were smashed to pieces. Some were hurled over the engine, others crumpled, rolling sideways onto the adjacent northern track. Amazingly, only 2 passengers on the local train were killed. But for the Royal Scots, the horror had only just begun. As dazed soldiers climbed out onto the track and looked back at their dead comrades, Signalman Meakin, now fully aware of what had happened, knew another disaster was just seconds away. The Glasgow-bound express was hurtling towards them, unaware of the wreckage ahead. Meakin tried to change the signal, but it was too late. The train had already passed the point of no return. The crew of the coal train were running down the track, waving their hands at the oncoming express. The fireman of the express saw them and shouted to slow down. The driver of the express applied the brakes, but it was too late. Just 53 seconds after that first crash, the express train struck the wreckage of the troop train. The force of the collision triggered the gas tanks fitted beneath the wooden carriages on the troop train to explode. In seconds, an inferno had engulfed the track. A reporter later wrote, "In a moment, all was terrible confusion. Engines were heaped upon each other, carriages overturned, others mounted upon the next. Men were hurled from the train. The fortunate few fell clear. Others clambered from the wreckage as best they could, but many were pinned beneath the overturned carriages." The gas-fed fire spread rapidly. Some soldiers were trapped behind jammed doors. Others tried to smash windows to escape. The heat was so intense that the steelwork of the express carriages buckled and twisted like molten wire. Some survivors would later speak of unimaginable horrors in that inferno. Men using bayonets to amputate limbs in order to escape. Others simply cutting their own throats with jackknives. And one claim, made decades later, is still debated to this day. Private Peter Stoddart, one of the last known survivors of the crash, claimed in the 1980s that an officer used his revolver to put some of the trapped men out of their misery. The story has never been officially verified, although a later lieutenant colonel in the regiment would go on to say that under the circumstances, it was entirely possible. Those nearby rushed to help. Local farmers, doctors, even passing motorists hurried to the scene. But the fire was fierce. It would burn for 23 hours, reducing the wreckage to charred timber and twisted metal. Casualties were placed on the express train, whose engine and most of his carriages remained intact, and reversed rapidly back down the line to the hospital at Carlisle. Colonel Peebles, the commanding officer of the battalion, managed to survive. At 4 p.m. that afternoon, with the fire still smouldering, he conducted a roll call. Unfortunately, the battalion's roll had actually been destroyed in the Inferno. Peebles simply wrote down the names of those who were present. The battalion set out with 485 men on board this train. Only 67 were present and uninjured at the roll call. In total, 227 people died in the Quintinshill rail disaster, including 216 from the 7th Battalion Royal Scots and 11 civilians. A further 246 were injured. Most of the bodies were so badly burned that they were beyond recognition. Only 83 of the dead would ever be positively identified. The funerals of the dead soldiers took place just 2 days later. On the 24th of May, 101 coffins were carried in procession through the streets of Edinburgh to a communal grave at Rosebank Cemetery in Leith. They were laid to rest less than a mile from the drill hall where those volunteers had trained. Shops closed, traffic stopped. Over 3,000 soldiers lined the route, which is roughly the same number as those who lined the path at Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. Behind them, thousands of citizens stood in silent tribute. Of the 67 men who survived the crash, only Colonel Peebles and 6 officers were declared fit for active duty. The rest of the survivors, mentally and physically scarred, were sent back to Edinburgh and took part in the funerals of their fallen comrades. Meanwhile, B and C companies, who travelled by a different route, continued to Liverpool. They, along with Peebles and his 6 officers, embarked aboard the Empress of Britain and joined the rest of the 52nd Division at Gallipoli. Just over a month after the disaster, on the 28th of June, the half-strength battalion took part in a major assault at Gully Ravine, where they suffered heavy losses against the Turks. The men who returned to Edinburgh after the disaster at Quintinshill were eventually reunited with the rest of the battalion at Gallipoli in September 1915, where they remained until evacuated in January 1916. The battalion was redeployed to Egypt and then served in the Palestine campaign throughout 1916 and 1917. In April 1918, the battalion was transferred to the Western Front in France to help reinforce British lines during the German Spring Offensive. There they served until the end of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Peebles remained with his battalion throughout these campaigns. He survived the war and lived out his remaining years in Edinburgh, where he died in 1955. A board of inquiry at Dumfries Sheriff's Court was convened just 3 days after the disaster. Its findings exposed several weaknesses in the Caledonian Rail Company's operations, and yet the final conclusion placed all the blame on the 2 men in the box. Both James Tinsley and George Meakin were arrested 1 week after the crash and tried at the High Court in Edinburgh. They were found guilty of culpable homicide. Meakin was sentenced to 18 months and Tinsley to 3 years in prison. In the end, both men served only 1 year. After their release, both men returned to work for the Caledonian Railway, although not in a signal box. Tinsley became a lamplighter. Meakin later became a coal merchant, working at the very same Quintinshill sidings. Whilst the court placed the blame squarely on the 2 men, and while their negligence was undeniable, unauthorised guests in the signal box, unread telegrams, failure to look out the window, some began to question whether they were the only ones at fault. A BBC documentary many years later raised an uncomfortable possibility that Tinsley and Meakin were to some extent scapegoats. The war had placed immense pressure on Britain's railways. Troop trains were supposed to have priority, and yet civilian and freight services were still operating at full tilt. Safety procedures were outdated. Many of the carriages were obsolete and would have been due to be taken out of service, but for the war. The Caledonian Railway Company had already been warned about poor signalling oversight. But none of those in upper management were ever held accountable for this disaster. One doctor during the investigation actually pointed out that Tinsley suffered from epilepsy, a condition that may have affected his awareness that morning. But this too was quietly ignored in court. Intriguingly, both men were re-employed by the company. Hardly normal practice for any employee who had caused multiple deaths by gross negligence and disregarding company policies and procedures. So, was this their reward for taking the rap? I guess we'll never know. Whoever was responsible, the disaster devastated the community of Leith. The 7th Battalion, drawn almost entirely from this small Scottish burh, had been gutted. It was said that every family in the close-knit community had lost either a relative or someone they knew. And unlike many other communities across the country who suffered similar experiences in World War I, this massive loss wasn't even on the battlefield. A memorial was raised by public subscription in Rosebank Cemetery, a 15-foot Celtic cross made of Peterhead granite. It bears the names of 216 soldiers who died. 2 of those names had somehow been omitted in 1915 and were only added at the centenary of the disaster. 216 men who never even reached the battlefield. And let's not forget that at least 11 civilians also died in this tragedy. The problem with getting an exact figure is that there were no records of passengers travelling, and the Inferno so fierce that bodies were either not able to be identified or maybe completely destroyed. What we do know is that Rachel Nimmo and her infant son Dixon, who were travelling on the local train, were definitely killed. So too with the driver and fireman of the troop train, Francis Scott and James Hanna. Hanna having previously survived a serious accident in 1907. On the express, it's believed that at least 3 passengers died, along with the sleeping car attendant. Over the years, people have claimed that long-lost relatives might have been on the train, and that 3 children had stowed away on the troop train as it passed through Maryhill near Glasgow. So that civilian figure might be higher than officially claimed. The Quintinshill railway disaster is full of so many what-ifs. What if Tinsley had arrived on time and filled in the train record as trains passed, rather than playing catch-up? What if both that and the presence of a signal box full of chattering men hadn't distracted him? What if the rail company management had been aware, or not turned a blind eye, to his and Meakin's arriving late for their shift wheeze? What if the Caledonian Railway hadn't continued to run a full civilian service alongside a wartime service? What if the government had ordered them not to do so? What if obsolete rolling stock hadn't been used? What if the Aquitania hadn't run aground in the Mersey and the Royal Scots had set out a day before as scheduled? It's a tragedy that could at so many moments have been avoided. During the Great War, the Royal Scots raised 35 battalions, including a Bantam battalion and Macrae's football players and supporters battalion. Over 100,000 men served in the regiment, fighting on the Western Front, Gallipoli, Egypt, and even in the Russian Civil War. More than 11,000 of their number were killed. 216 of those men were killed on British soil, not by the enemy, but in a terrible railway crash that could have been averted. The Quintinshill railway disaster remains to this day Britain's deadliest train crash. More than a century later, it serves as a sobering reminder of how, even far from the front lines, war can extract a devastating toll. For the people of Leith and Edinburgh, it was a day of unimaginable loss. And for the men of the 7th Battalion Royal Scots, their war began and for many ended, not facing the Turkish machine guns at Gallipoli, but in the early morning light near the Scottish-English border. Well, I hope you found that poignant story both sad and interesting at the same time. A big shout out to everyone who supports me as patrons, members here on YouTube, or by donating in the super chat below. I really couldn't do all of this without you. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, And I hope to see you again with more stories from British history very soon.